There is a man named Major Hans Stobe who almost nobody remembers, and he may have lost the war for Germany with a single sentence. He was a meteorologist. On the first days of June 1944, he studied the pressure charts moving across the North Atlantic, and he watched a storm roll toward the English Channel, and he told the German High Command exactly what the data told him. The weather was closing in. The sea would be too rough for landing craft, the cloud too low for aircraft, the tides wrong for weeks after that. No sane commander would launch an invasion into it. The window was shut, and it would stay shut for days. He was right about the storm. He was completely wrong about everything that mattered, because the Germans and the Allies were reading the same sky, and they came to opposite conclusions, and only one of them was watching closely enough to notice the crack in the weather. The Allied forecasters found something the Germans missed: a narrow gap, barely a day wide, when the storm would ease just enough. One thin slot of survivable weather in an otherwise hopeless forecast. And into that slot, an American general named Eisenhower said one word: go. So on the night of June the 5th, while 5,000 ships were already dark shapes on the water, moving toward the coast of France, the German army guarding that coast believed, on excellent authority, that it was going to rain for a week and nothing was going to happen. They had been told by their own experts to relax. And they did. This is the story of that night, and the morning that followed. Not the version you know. Not the beaches from the water. Not the ramps dropping. Not the men wading into fire. That story has been told 1,000 times, and it is a story of extraordinary courage. But turn the camera around. Point it at the concrete. Put yourself inside the bunker, looking out. Because from where the German soldiers stood, D-Day was not a battle. It was the sky falling in. It was the moment a machine that had swallowed Europe in 18 months discovered that it had been built on a lie, and that the lie was about to be exposed to the whole world in the space of a single morning. This is the story of the men who were supposed to stop the invasion. The generals who couldn't move. The orders that never came. The soldier who fired 13,000 rounds and understood, somewhere around the 10,000th, that none of it was going to be enough. The question people always ask about D-Day is how the Allies got ashore against such a formidable enemy. The better question, the one almost nobody asks, is this: how did the most feared army on earth stand on the cliffs of Normandy, watch the largest fleet in human history appear out of the mist, and do almost nothing? To answer that, you have to go back before the ships. You have to go into a quiet room in France, months earlier, where two old soldiers were arguing about how to lose the war as slowly as possible. The first of them was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and he was, in every sense that the German army recognized, the top of the pyramid. Commander-in-Chief West, 70 years old. He had been a soldier for half a century, since before there was a tank in any army anywhere, and he carried himself with the cold, finished authority of a man who had simply always been in command of something. He was the last living link to the old Prussian tradition, the army of maps and railway timetables and grand decisive movements, the army that had crushed France in 6 weeks in 1940 and made the whole world reconsider what was possible. And von Rundstedt looked at the problem of the invasion the way that tradition had taught him to look at every problem, which was from above, like a man over a chessboard. His plan was patient. Let them land. Don't waste your strength scattering it along 400 miles of coastline you cannot possibly defend everywhere. Instead, hold your armor back, deep inland, gathered into a fist. Let the Allies come ashore. Let them believe they've succeeded. Let them stretch their supply lines thin and crowd their men into a narrow strip of beach. And then, at the moment of your choosing, bring the panzers down in one enormous coordinated blow and throw the whole thing back into the sea. It was elegant. It was classical. It was exactly how you would have won the last war. And it depended entirely on one assumption that was no longer true: that a German tank could move where it wanted, when it wanted, and arrive intact. The second man in the room knew that assumption was dead because he had watched it die. His name was Erwin Rommel. You know the name. the Desert Fox, the most famous German general of the war, admired even by the men he was trying to kill. But by the time he arrived in France in late 1943 to take command of the coastal defenses, Rommel was not the swaggering cavalier of the newsreels anymore. He was a man who had been beaten and who had paid close attention to how. In North Africa, Rommel had commanded the finest armored troops Germany had, masters of movement, and he had watched them get taken apart from the air. Not outfought on the ground, hunted. He had learned what it meant to fight an enemy who owned the sky, and it was a lesson that rearranged everything he thought he knew about war. A tank is a magnificent weapon. A tank on an open road in daylight, with enemy aircraft overhead, is a coffin that hasn't caught fire yet. So when Rommel inspected von Rundstedt's beautiful plan, the plan to hold the armor back and strike at the perfect moment, he saw a fantasy. There would be no perfect moment. There would be no grand movement of tanks across France, because the tanks would never make it across France. The Allied air forces would find them on the roads and burn them there, one column at a time, hours before they ever reached the coast. Von Rundstedt was planning a cavalry charge in a world that had learned to shoot the horses from 10,000 feet. Then Rommel went and looked at the Atlantic Wall itself, the great fortress that Nazi propaganda showed the German people in cinema newsreels, the impregnable rampart running from Norway to Spain. And what he found made his stomach turn. It wasn't a wall, it was a rumor of a wall. Strong points here and there, some of them impressive, many of them half-finished, most of them undermanned, and between them long empty stretches of sand and cliff, where a determined enemy could walk ashore and meet nobody. The garrison was a patchwork. Aging men, wounded men rotated out of Russia to recover, whole units of conscripted foreigners from the eastern territories who had no particular reason to die for Berlin. The impregnable fortress of the newsreels was, in a great many places, a line drawn on a map and very little else. Rommel threw himself at it. In the months before the invasion, he drove the defenses forward with a kind of fury. Millions of mines laid in the sand, steel obstacles studded across the beaches to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, stakes driven into the fields inland to smash gliders. He was trying, in the time he had, to turn a facade into a real barrier. And underneath the effort was a conviction he stated as plainly as he could to anyone who would listen, all the way up to Hitler's headquarters. The invasion, he said, will be decided on the beach, in the water, in the first hours, before they can organize, before they can dig in, while they are still wet and disorganized and vulnerable. Miss that window, and you have lost, no matter how many tanks you gather afterward. He put it in a single sentence that has outlived him. The first 24 hours, he told his aide, will be decisive. For the Allies, and for us. It will be the longest day. He was right. Every word of it turned out to be right, which makes what happened next almost unbearable to trace. 2 field marshals, 2 plans that could not both be true. Hold the armor back or push it to the coast. One of them was correct, and the man who had to choose between them was Adolf Hitler, who did what men do when they cannot bear to decide. He chose both, in a way that guaranteed neither would work. He gave Rommel a portion of the panzer divisions to position near the coast, as Rommel wanted. He kept the strongest divisions back as a central reserve as von Rundstedt wanted, and then he did the thing that turned a compromise into a catastrophe. He took that central reserve, the mailed fist that both generals agreed would be needed the moment the blow fell, and he placed it under the control of neither of them. Those divisions could not move to meet an invasion unless the order came from Hitler personally, from his headquarters, from wherever he happened to be, whatever he happened to be doing, however he happened to be sleeping. Read that again and sit with it, because it is the whole battle in a single administrative fact. In a fight that everyone agreed would be won or lost in a matter of hours, the most powerful weapon Germany possessed had been wired directly to one man's bedroom, hundreds of miles away, in the mountains of Bavaria. The command structure wasn't just flawed, it was designed, almost as if on purpose, to lose the exact race it was about to be forced to run. The house was divided before a single shot was fired, and its master had gone home. On the evening of June the 5th, Rommel got into his staff car and told his driver to take him to Germany. Think about who was leaving. The one senior commander who had correctly diagnosed the entire problem. The man who believed, more fiercely than anyone, that the first hours would decide everything, and that a general's place in those hours was at the front, screaming the machine into motion. If any man on the German side was going to grab the frozen command structure by the throat and force the tanks to the beaches while it still mattered, it was Rommel. And he was driving in the opposite direction. Why? For the most human reason imaginable. The weather said there would be no invasion. His own meteorologists, the storm on the water, every scrap of intelligence pointed the same way. And June the 6th was his wife Lucy's birthday. He had presents in the car, a pair of gray suede shoes he'd bought for her in Paris, the size she'd asked for. He was going to be home in Herrlingen for her birthday, have dinner, maybe raise the question of the invasion with Hitler in person while he was in Germany, and be back at his headquarters in a few days, well before the weather cleared. It was a completely reasonable plan, built on completely reasonable information, and it was wrong. And it removed the one man who might have made a difference from the board at the exact moment he was needed most. He would spend the morning of the longest day, the day he had named, driving through the German countryside with a pair of shoes on the seat beside him, hundreds of miles from the coast he had sworn to defend, not yet knowing that it had already begun. Along that coast, the men on watch heard the storm and believed what the storm told them. Picture one of them. 20 years old, maybe. In a concrete box overlooking a stretch of gray water the Allies had given a code name he'd never heard. It's cold for June. The wind comes off the channel and moves the long grass on the roof of the bunker, and the sea makes the ordinary noise the sea always makes. He's tired. He's a long way from home. He's thinking about home, the way soldiers on a quiet watch always end up thinking about home, in an occupied country full of people who hate them, on a night when nothing is going to happen. He does not know that 5,000 ships are already on the water. He does not know that 150,000 men have been packed onto those ships and are, at this very moment, crossing toward him in the dark. He does not know that the week of bad weather he was promised has quietly narrowed to a single day, and that on the other side of that day is the largest seaborne invasion the world will ever see, and that it is not coming next week or the week after, but tonight, right now, closing the distance while he watches the grass move. He knows only that it's raining, that his officers told him to stand down, and that the sea is empty. So he drinks his coffee. He talks quietly with the others. Some of them write letters. Some of them sleep. And out beyond the range of any eye or instrument they have, the horizon is already full of steel. The first sign that the night was wrong came not from the sea but from the sky, and it came just after midnight. The telephone started ringing at the headquarters of the German 84th Corps, near a Norman town called St. Lo. The man they were ringing for was General Erich Marx, and if you had to pick one German officer to have his hand on the situation that night, you could do a great deal worse. Marx was 53. He had left his right leg on the Eastern Front, taken off by a Soviet shell in 1941, and he walked on a wooden prosthetic that his staff had long since stopped noticing. He had a first-class operational mind, and he stood at his map table in the middle of the night and tried to make the reports in front of him mean something. They wouldn't cooperate. Paratroopers. That much was clear. But not in one place. Not in a tight drop on some obvious objective he could rush men to defend. They were everywhere at once. Reports flooding in from all across the Cotentin Peninsula, from garrisons and observation posts, and terrified men in the dark who'd seen a canopy blossom over a field, or heard something crash into the trees. Contacts here, gunfire there, an engine overhead somewhere else, scattered across miles of country in a pattern that fit no doctrine Marx had ever studied. And Marx, being good at his job, understood at once that the pattern could mean two entirely different things. It could be a real airborne assault, a big one, thrown into confusion by the same storm that everyone said had canceled the invasion, its men blown miles off course and landing wherever the wind dropped them. Chaos, but real chaos, the leading edge of the main event. Or it could be a magician's trick, a deliberate mess, engineered to look exactly like that, designed to make a general do precisely what Marx was tempted to do, which was pour his reserves into the cotton tan chasing ghosts, while the real hammer came down somewhere else entirely. What Marx could not know was that some of the parachutes coming down in the dark had no men under them at all. The Allies had scattered hundreds of dummies across Normandy that night. Crude fabric figures, roughly man-shaped, rigged with small charges that popped and crackled on landing to imitate the sound of rifle fire and burning equipment. From the ground, in the dark, in the rain, a German sentry could not tell the difference between a company of enemy paratroopers and a field full of exploding dolls. And so units went chasing the dolls. Firefights broke out against no one. Alarms spread outward from empty fields. The deception worked exactly as it was meant to, which was to make the German picture of the night not just incomplete but actively, deliberately false. So Marx did the careful thing, the professional thing. He put his corps on alert, and he did not commit his armor. Because everyone above him, all the way up, had been certain for months that when the real invasion came, it would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing, the shortest road to Germany. The obvious choice, if you were the Allies, and the Germans had convinced themselves the Allies would make the obvious choice. To fling his one armored reserve into the cotton tan now, chasing what might be a feint, would leave the true landing zone naked when the true landing came. Every instinct that 5 years of war had drilled into him said the same word. Wait. He waited. And the reports climbed up the chain, from corps to army to von Rundstedt's grand headquarters in Paris, and at every level they met the same reassuring shrug. A raid. A diversion. A big one, certainly, but not the thing itself. And in the mountains of Bavaria, the man who held the leash on the panzers slept on, and no one dared wake him. If Marx's caution was understandable, what happened higher up the chain was something closer to a tragedy of design. Consider General Fritz Bayerlein. He commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, which was, by common agreement, about the finest armored division in the German army. Fresh, powerful, superbly equipped, and positioned well enough to matter. Bayerlein heard the news out of Normandy and needed no map to understand it. His whole career had prepared him to know what to do with tanks in a moment like this, which was to get them moving toward the coast before the enemy could set his feet. So he spent the morning of the 6th on the telephone, his voice going hoarse, asking for the only thing that mattered. Permission to move. Follow that request on its journey, because the journey is the point. It went first to his corps headquarters. Yes, they agreed, absolutely, move at once. But we cannot give the order. It went up to Army Group. Yes, obviously, they said, but the authority isn't ours. It went to von Rundstedt's staff in Paris, the Commander-in-Chief West himself, and even there the answer was the same. Yes. God. Yes. But that reserve can only be released by OKW, by the High Command, by Hitler. And so it climbed the last rung to the top, to the operations staff of the OKW, where a man named Alfred Jodl held in his hands the power to end the paralysis. Jodl could have gone and woken Hitler. He had the reports. He had the frantic requests from Paris. He had, quite literally, the fate of the German position in the West, sitting on his desk in the form of a decision that only one sleeping man was allowed to make. He looked at it all, and he thought about what it would cost him to wake the Führer with news that might turn out to be false. He thought about the rage that would follow if he dragged Hitler out of bed for a feint. And he decided to wait until the picture was clearer. So the finest armored divisions in the West sat exactly where they were. Engines cold, fuel in the tanks, crews standing around their machines in the growing light, listening to a far-off thunder that wasn't thunder, looking at the sky, asking each other why no one had told them to move. The most valuable weapon Germany owned on the most important day of the war was fully loaded, fully crewed, and completely still, because a chain of confident, careful, reasonable men had each decided, correctly, that the decision was somebody else's to make. And above all of them, the Führer slept. While the generals debated and the reserve stood idle, The men in the bunkers heard a new sound, and this one did not come from the sky. It came from the water. Low at first. A deep rolling murmur under the wind, so faint that a man might tell himself he'd imagined it. But it didn't fade. It grew. Minute by minute it thickened and spread until it was coming from everywhere along the horizon at once, a continuous mechanical rumble with no gap in it, the sound of more engines than any of them had ever heard gathered in one place. Men pressed their faces to the observation slits and strained into the dark and could see nothing. Just the sound, swelling, filling the whole world in front of them, coming closer. They didn't have a word for what they were hearing, because nothing on earth had ever sounded like it before. Then the dark began to thin. The storm had blown itself down in the night, and a gray, reluctant dawn came up over the water, and the mist started to lift, and the men in the concrete found out what had been making the sound. Inland from the beach, the Allies were calling Omaha. A German artillery officer named Werner Pluskat put his eye to a powerful rangefinder and swept it along the horizon, looking for the source of the noise. He could not find the horizon. Where the empty line of sea and sky should have been, there was steel. Ships. Not a formation of ships, not a fleet in the way he understood the word, but a solid mass of hulls and masts and gun turrets, stretching from one edge of his vision to the other, and past the edges, past the limits of a very good instrument, on and on into the haze. He swung the rangefinder left, searching for where the fleet ended. It didn't end. He swung it right. It didn't end that way either. There was no flank to it. There was no edge. Pluskat had spent his whole life around the sea, and he groped for a way to describe what he was looking at, and the words he finally reached for were not military at all. It did not look like a navy, he said. It looked like a city. A vast gray city of iron that had risen out of the channel overnight and was now sitting off the coast of France, silent, waiting, aimed directly at him. In a strong point above the same beach, a place the Germans called Widerstandsnest 62, a 20-year-old named Heinrich Severloh looked out through his slit and saw the same impossible thing. He'd been a soldier for 2 years. He'd stood in this position for months, staring at an empty ocean in every kind of weather, and the ocean had always been empty. It was not empty now. There was no room left in it for water. At about 10 minutes to 6 in the morning, the city on the sea opened its guns. Nothing in any training, in any manual, in any veteran's war story had prepared these men for the naval bombardment, because there had never been a bombardment like it. Battleships. More than a dozen of them, and beyond them cruisers, and beyond the cruisers a wall of destroyers, and all of them firing together, shell after shell after shell, a weight of metal pouring onto the coast that the human mind is not built to take in. And here is the detail that the men remembered forever, the thing that broke the world into a before and an after. The shells arrived before the sound of the guns that fired them. The battleships were so far out that the projectiles outran their own thunder. So the first thing a German soldier knew of the bombardment was not a distant flash and a warning roll of noise. It was the ground itself detonating around him, the concrete lurching under his boots, dust and grit and pressure slamming through the bunker, and only then, a beat too late, the deep, unified roar of the guns rolling in across the water to explain what had already happened. Inside the strong points, men were thrown off their feet and pinned to the floor by the shaking. The air went white with pulverized concrete. Some positions took direct hits and simply ceased to exist. But the deadliest damage was quieter than that, and it was exactly the damage Rommel had feared. The telephone lines went first, snapped and buried in the opening minutes. Then the field radios drowned in the electromagnetic chaos of the barrage, useless. And with that, the thing that had made the Atlantic Wall an army rather than a row of boxes was gone. The wall had been designed as a network, strong point linked to strong point, artillery talking to observers, the whole coast able to concentrate its fire and coordinate its defense. In the space of a few minutes, all of that was cut. Every bunker became an island, deaf. blind past its own firing slit, unable to call for help, unable to warn its neighbors, unable to do anything but fight its own small, isolated war against whatever came out of the smoke. And then, through the smoke, the boats came in. Heinrich Severloh was at his machine gun when the first wave touched the sand below him. The weapon was an MG-42, the finest light machine gun of the war, and it fired so fast, 1,200 rounds a minute, that men who heard it could not pick out individual shots. It didn't rattle. It tore. A single long ripping shriek, and the sound alone was enough to make experienced troops flatten themselves into the earth. Severloh had been a farmer before the war. He had never wanted to be a soldier, and had no love for any of it. But he had been trained, and his position at WN-62 looked down onto the beach at an angle that turned that stretch of sand into a killing ground. And when the ramps of the landing craft dropped, and the American infantry started forward into the shallows, Severloh settled behind the gun and did what he had been trained to do. He was appallingly good at it. For hours, Heinrich Severloh was the master of his little piece of the invasion. The men coming ashore below him were cut down in the water, on the ramps, on the open sand, in the surf, wherever his fire could reach, and it could reach almost everywhere. He knew the ground. He knew the ranges. He walked his fire across the beach with the patience of a man who had learned a trade, and the beach filled with the dead, and the drowning, and the men crawling for whatever cover the sand didn't offer. He fed belt after belt into the gun. The barrel glowed. He had to change it, burning his hands, and go back to firing. By every measure his training had given him, he was doing his job perfectly. And then slowly, over the course of that endless morning, something started to come apart inside him. Not his nerve, not his skill. Something underneath both of those. His understanding of what he was doing. Because the Americans would not stop coming. That was the thing he could not make sense of. He had been taught and had believed that accurate defensive fire breaks an attack. You kill enough of the men in front, and the attack falters, the survivors go to ground, the momentum dies, the will to advance drains out of them. This was not opinion. It was the hard, bloody arithmetic the German army had written across 5 years of war. Fire like this was supposed to end an assault. This assault would not end. For every man he dropped, 2 more came out of the surf behind him. For every landing craft his fire swept clean, another slid in behind it and dropped its ramp and spilled another dozen men onto the sand. He looked for the bottom of it, the point where the enemy would run out of bodies to throw at him, and there was no bottom. Where the dead lay, more men came and stepped over the dead and kept walking forward into his fire. Behind them, more boats. Behind the boats, the gray city on the horizon, feeding the beach an endless supply of human beings. Severloh's hands kept working the gun, but his mind had gone somewhere cold and clear. He was counting. He knew, roughly, how many men he had killed, and the number was terrible, larger than he wanted to think about. And the beach below him was more crowded with Americans now than it had been when he started. He was not stopping the tide. He was not slowing the tide. He was one man with one gun trying to hold back something that simply did not have an end, and every round he fired only proved to him more completely that it could not be done. Before the day was out, Severloh would fire something on the order of 13,000 rounds. 13,000. And what ran out that day was not the ammunition. It was the belief, drummed into him and into the whole German army, that a man behind good concrete with a good gun could stop an enemy who had decided to come no matter the cost. He kept firing long after he stopped believing it would matter. By then, he was just a farmer feeding a machine, watching an ocean pour men onto a beach he could not hold. In the afternoon, while Severloh was still firing and the Americans were beginning, at a horrifying price, to claw their way up off the sand, the German counterattack finally moved, not the great Central Reserve. That was still frozen in place, wired to a Führer who did not even learn that the invasion had begun until the middle of the morning, and who, when he did learn, remained convinced for hours more that Normandy was the feint, and the real blow was still coming at the Pas de Calais. He held the panzers back to meet an attack that would never arrive. So the counterattack, when it came from the one armored division near enough to the coast to act on its own, the 21st Panzer Division, the only such division Rommel had managed to place within striking distance of the beaches, moving on a mission he had prepared for exactly this moment. Even that had taken nearly 3 hours of the barrage before it received clearance for so much as a limited advance. By the time its tanks were rolling toward the sea in the early afternoon, the Allied beachhead had been hardening for half a day. A colonel named Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski led a battle group of tanks through the ruin of the Norman countryside toward the water. And the countryside was a preview of everything to come. The roads were littered with knocked-out vehicles. Refugees streamed inland, away from the coast, dragging what they could carry. Everywhere were the signs of a defensive system quietly falling to pieces, orders contradicting orders, units out of contact, the whole coherent machine dissolving into individual men trying to survive. But von Oppeln-Bronichowski kept his tanks moving, threaded them through the chaos, and by the middle of the afternoon he did something remarkable. He reached the sea. His tanks pushed all the way through to the coast, near a village called Lyon-sur-Mer, into a gap between two of the British landing zones, and for a few hours his crews could look out and see the grey water of the English Channel in front of them. He had done it. He had driven armor to the beach and split the enemy landings, exactly the kind of swift, aggressive counterstroke Rommel had begged for. For one afternoon, on one narrow slice of the coast, it looked like the right doctrine might just work. The tanks were at the water. The response had come. Maybe, there was still a battle to be fought here. Then Rommel's lesson from the desert came for them, the way it had come for his men in Africa, out of the sky. The German soldiers had a name for them. Jabos. Fighter bombers. And on the afternoon of June the 6th, they filled the air over Normandy. Royal Air Force Typhoons and American Thunderbolts, wheeling and diving over the countryside, hunting anything on the ground that moved. For a tank crew, there was no answer to them. None. A Panzer's main gun was built to kill other tanks. It could not be raised into the sky. The machine guns were a joke against a fighter coming down at 400 miles an hour. So the men in the tanks did the only thing they could do, which was look up through the periscope, see the aircraft peel off and drop toward them, and understand in that instant that there was nothing whatsoever they could do about it. The rockets came off the rails. The tanks came apart. On the radio net for a few seconds there were voices, and then there weren't. By evening, von Oppeln-Bronichowski's spearhead had been shattered. Dozens of his tanks were burning in the Norman fields. And here is the thing that should be carved somewhere. They were not destroyed by British tanks. They were not stopped by British anti-tank guns or British infantry. They were destroyed almost entirely from the air. By aircraft, the German army on that coast had no way to reach or fight. The colonel who had driven all the way to the sea was driven back from it, not by the enemy in front of him, but by the enemy above him. Everything Rommel had learned in Africa, at the cost of his entire army, was being taught to the German command a second time, in a single afternoon, at the cost of the only armor that had reached the fight. You cannot win a battle from the ground when the other man owns the sky. The Allies owned the sky over Normandy completely, and with that, the door closed. The beachhead was sealed. There would be no throwing anyone back into the sea, not that day, not any day. The invaders were ashore, and they were digging in, and above them the fighter bombers circled like a lid coming down on a pot. That evening, in Paris, the telephone rang in the headquarters of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. It was Jodl from the High Command, and he laid out the day. The beaches were lost, the counterattacks had failed. The Allies were ashore in strength, digging in under a sky the German Air Force could not enter. And Jodl asked the 70-year-old Field Marshal, the Commander-in-Chief West, the living embodiment of the whole Prussian military tradition, what he thought should be done. Von Rundstedt did not give a military answer. He had watched, in the space of a single day, the collapse of the doctrine he had believed in for 50 years. He had seen the command structure he trusted freeze at the exact moment it was needed. He had seen the tanks arrive too late and die from the air, and he had run the arithmetic that any professional soldier of his experience could run, and he had arrived at the only honest conclusion available to a man looking at the reality of June 6, 1944. "Make peace," he said. "You fools. What else can you do?" The line went quiet. The most senior field marshal Germany had in the West, the man at the very top of the pyramid, had looked at the maps and told the High Command to end the war. Not next year. Not after the next offensive. Now. Because it was already over, and everyone at his level who was willing to be honest could see it. Hitler did not make peace. Of course he didn't. He gave an order instead, and the order was the one he always gave when the truth became unbearable. No retreat. Stand fast. Hold every position to the last man. Die where you stand. And that order, more than the landings themselves, is what turned a lost battle into a slaughtered army. Because it held German units in exposed, hopeless positions, forbidden to fall back to ground they might have defended, until the Allies simply flowed around them and swallowed them whole. It ran, 2 months later, into a place called the Falaise Pocket, where an entire German army group was encircled and destroyed on the roads of one small French valley. Everything that 4 years of occupation had built and gathered and dug in, the tanks and the guns and the trucks and the horses and the men, was funneled into a closing ring and torn apart from the air and the ground until the roads weren't roads anymore. They were open graves. The army that had once stood on the cliffs of the Channel looking hungrily toward England staggered out of Falaise as a mob of exhausted ghosts, hunting for a gap in a net that was pulling shut around them. The man who crawled out of the Falaise Pocket in August was not the same creature who had sat in his bunker on the night of June the 5th, listening to the storm, writing a letter home, going to sleep on the promise that nothing was coming. That earlier man had been protected by things he couldn't see. By the concrete around him, yes, but more than that, by certainty. By the belief that the Atlantic Wall was real, that the command above him was sound, that if the invasion ever came, the orders and the tanks and the whole vast machinery of the German army would arrive in time to save him. He had trusted the wall, and he had trusted the men who told him the weather was safe, and he had trusted that somewhere above his little concrete box, someone was in control. The survivor of August knew better. He had learned what the Atlantic Wall actually was, which was a myth painted onto a coastline for the newsreels. He had learned what the great command structure actually produced when it mattered, which was paralysis, a chain of careful men each passing the decision upward until it reached a sleeping man who never got the message in time. He had learned what happens to an army that fights an enemy who owns the sky using a doctrine built for a world where nobody did. The Atlantic Wall was never stormed. That's the thing people miss. It was never broken in some titanic clash of fortress against invader. It was exposed. The invasion didn't smash through a fortress. It walked through a stage set, and in the smoke of that morning and the 2 ruined months that followed, every German soldier who survived understood one thing with a clarity that no amount of propaganda could ever paint over again. Rommel had been right about all of it. The beaches were everything he said they were. The first 24 hours were exactly as decisive as he had warned. And on the night before, when the one man who understood that most completely was driving home through the German dark with a pair of gray suede shoes on the seat beside him, certain in his bones that no invasion could possibly come for days, the invasion had already left the coast of England. It was already on the water. It was already crossing toward the sleeping coast in the dark. It was already coming. And not one of the men who could have stopped it was awake.